A quick warning, right out of the gate. This story is nothing short of a nightmare. What this stepfather did is unthinkable. An 11-year-old girl gives birth inside her Oklahoma home. And now the allegations that the stepfather faced, they are fact. His fate is sealed. What comes next for the others involved in this disturbing case is unclear, but it certainly is true that this is the kind of story that will bring out every negative emotion. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. All right, guys, real quick, I want to talk about our sponsor today, and it's an important one because staying on top of the news is crucial. But if you have concerns about media bias and you're asking yourself, I don't know who or what to believe, let me introduce you to our sponsor, Straight Arrow News. Straight Arrow News is a personalized news platform that gives readers fact-based journalism to inform and build trust. Their media miss tool shows readers headlines that are not seen on mainstream outlets, providing useful commentary that cuts through sensational spin. Their site and app also points out biases with the media landscape to group sources by political leaning for full transparency. So if you're ready for a better way to get the news, go to san.com/OTC or just click the link in my description. Straight Arrow News, skip the drama, get the facts. Welcome back to trustworthy journalism. It is truly hard to find any words for this story. The way a stepfather appears to have handled the allegations that he faced does tell you a lot. This is that stepfather. His name is Dustin Walker, and he just admitted guilt to the kind of charges that as a human being, it's hard to fathom. This is video of when he made a court appearance in Oklahoma per KJRH TV. The story taking place about an hour away from Tulsa. Now, the charges that Walker faced: felony sexual abuse of a child under the age of 12 and 6 felony counts of child neglect. And he has pleaded guilty to all of them. But this guilty plea does not come as part of a plea deal. And there's still some questions about how this case is going to play out. We're going to talk about that and what his punishment may be in just a moment. Now, even though it might be fair to say that there is not a punishment steep enough for what law enforcement found this man did. Now, he's not the only one who faced charges in this case. You have Walker's wife, her name is Cherie, and Cherie's mom, who's the victim's grandmother, and the newborn baby's great-grandmother. The two of them are also facing charges in this case. Now, before we break down what could happen to them, what their cases look like right now, I want to go back and lay out the disturbing details for you in this one. This story, at least for those on the outside and for law enforcement, it started on August 16th inside this home in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which is about an hour away from Tulsa. According to local media, the district attorney prosecuting this case said inside that home, an 11-year-old girl gave birth to a full-term baby on that day. Now, authorities say the 11-year-old victim, she hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year. And you just think about this young girl, what she went through, and the pregnancy that she had to go through. And she went through it out of the sight of medical professionals. She received no medical care, according to law enforcement. This girl wasn't enrolled in school either, so she was out of the sight of authority figures that potentially could have done something to help. Now, when law enforcement realized what had happened and they were trying to piece together how it could happen, they spoke to the girl's parents. So you have her mom, Cherie, and then you have the victim's stepdad, Dustin Walker. Now, initially, the Walkers told police that they were shocked that the girl gave birth, that they claimed that they had no idea that the 11-year-old girl was pregnant. Let's talk about that for a second, because the DA told local media that, frankly, it just seemed like a lie. The DA said the girl was, quote, petite, so at full term, an 11-year-old being pregnant, it would be obvious. Now, Dustin was 34 years old at the time of the arrest. The girl's mom was 33. Now, when we found the Facebook pages for the Walkers, we found pictures showing them holding young children, and neighbors told local media in Tulsa that 6 children lived inside that house along with multiple dogs and cats. And to make matters worse, the neighbors claimed that the house with all those people inside did not have running water for as long as 3 years leading up to the uncovering of this house of horror and the alleged abuse that took place inside. Now, here's how the investigation went down to our understanding. Police have this 11-year-old girl who gave birth. They have a baby, and they have the horrible conditions inside the home. And on top of that, you have the Walkers who are claiming they have no idea how any of this could happen. Now, at first, the Walkers were arrested, and their initial charges, 6 counts of child neglect, 1 for each child inside of the home. That baby, though, was tested for DNA, and that is when this sad and sick case took a major step forward, because the DNA came back and it showed reportedly with a 99% certainty that Dustin Walker was the father. And at that point, a charge of sexual abuse of a child under the age of 12 was added to his case. As far as Cherie Walker, Dustin's wife, she was charged with enabling sexual abuse. Cherie Walker did not appear to have a criminal record prior to this, but Dustin did. And we found 2 cases that involved him. You have one in 2020, where he was charged with firing a gun inside his home. And that case appears to have ended in him paying a fine. Records show that the case was sent to collections. Then in 2023, he was charged with domestic assault and battery in the presence of a minor. And that case was dismissed. Now, clearly the health and safety of the 11-year-old victim and the baby, as well as the other children who were living inside that home with the Walkers, is so important to focus on in this case. In the wake of the Walkers' arrest, the district attorney said the 11-year-old victim was traumatized and she had to give birth inside this home that reportedly did not have running water, and she did so without medical care. Now, on top of that, this girl hadn't seen a doctor in more than a year, and she had not been in school either. And you just think of those places, not just as places where you can get medical care, but those are places where people could have intervened. They could have stepped in and helped. But instead, this girl was kept out of sight, according to authorities. Now, one of the people accused of aiding the abuse in the horrific situation is Cherie's mom, the victim's grandmother and that newborn's great-grandmother, biologically. Her name is Michelle Justus. Now, on the day this story came to light, there was a reporter with KJRH-TV in Tulsa. This reporter went to the neighborhood just trying to gather information to tell this story and what happened. And she reported that there was a woman taking videos of her from across the street. She then approached that woman on her way out of the neighborhood, and this is what the woman told her.
We didn't know this was happening. None of us.
How do you think your granddaughter got pregnant?
She keeps telling us that it was the little 12-year-old.
Now, the woman you just heard speaking there, that is Michelle Justus. Here's her mugshot. And according to law enforcement, what you just heard her say to the reporter was a lie. Justus was arrested and charged with 6 counts of child neglect. It's believed a total of 6 children, again, lived inside that house, including the 11-year-old girl. Justus is reportedly that 11-year-old's grandmother, and she reportedly also lived in the home where that child gave birth. In fact, she's been accused of allegedly witnessing the birth. Now, at the time of this recording, Cherie Walker and Michelle Justus, they are still facing those charges. Their cases are ongoing. As far as Dustin Walker, he entered what's called a blind plea to these charges. And that means there's no plea deal in place, but he is entering pleas of guilty to all charges. And now it is up to the court to decide what his punishment will be. Previously, the DA told media outlets that Dustin could spend the rest of his life in prison based on these charges. His sentencing is set for June 18th. There's a pre-sentence investigation that will take place before that. Now, the charges he's pleading guilty to are also what are considered 85% crimes in Oklahoma, which means whatever his sentence is, he will have to serve at least 85% of it. Walker's defense attorney told KJRH-TV that it's not typical for him to advise a client to enter a blind plea, but in this situation, he, quote, didn't feel like there was one that we could get that would be useful or helpful in any way. And he described the potential punishment as, quote, wide open. Joining us now to talk more about this case is practice professor of law at Temple University and former child abuse and sex crimes prosecutor Marian Bracha. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. I know this story is just, it's incredibly difficult. What does it tell you that Dustin Walker enters a blind plea to all the charges that he's facing in this case?
Well, I think he probably received some advice from counsel that the prosecution's case was evidentiarily very strong. I think as we talked about when we first covered this case, it was entirely possible, or it would have been entirely possible, to proceed to trial and to try this entire case and present the entirety of the state's evidence against the defendant without live testimony. It very well could have been proven to the state's burden beyond a reasonable doubt, based on the medical records of the pregnancy and the birth and delivery, and the DNA results that match the defendant's DNA to the child who was born of this abuse. And so I think he recognized the strength of the prosecution's case against him, and is likely throwing himself at the mercy of the court and hoping for something less than a life sentence.
Yeah, what does a defendant get? I mean, when you're doing a blind plea as opposed to saying, I'm just going to try my hand at a trial. And in this case, it feels like the trial might have been, here's the DNA results, there it is. I mean, what does he get out of it if by just entering a blind plea?
I think what he gets out of it is, or at least what he's likely hoping to get out of it, is mercy from the court, is a recognition that he has spared the victim having to testify, or at least being involved in the court process at all, knowing that there is a criminal prosecution happening. It has spared her being contacted by investigators, by prosecutors, by other court personnel, asking if she would be inclined to give what's known as a victim impact statement. It spares the court system the resources and the time to go to a trial, which of course is still his constitutional right. But it's in recognition of the fact that those are costly and time-consuming endeavors to bring a defendant to trial. And so likely what he is thinking is that I am giving up these rights, and I hope that my sentencing judge will recognize that I could have exercised these rights and would have been constitutionally within my rights to demand a trial. But I am not, and I have not. And for that, could some mercy be shown in terms of, I don't think anyone's expecting leniency in this case. I don't think anyone's expecting, a slap on the wrist or any kind of probationary sentence. But in all likelihood, he's hoping for less than a life sentence, and would be essentially bargaining his constitutional rights against that hope.
What goes into a judge, the decision now? So he enters the blind plea. I know he's going to be sentenced. I think it's June 18th is the date. And they said there was going to be a pre-sentence investigation that goes on. Like, what's the process between he's entered this plea, he's pleading guilty, to then the moment the judge says, this is what your sentence is going to be?
Sure. So it varies state by state. But a pre-sentence investigation is typically a very intensive process by which an assigned investigator who's appointed by the court system does an intensive interview with the defendant himself to find out about a biographical history, psychological history, family history, sociological history, and also can conduct some interviews of people closest to the defendant. So in all likelihood, they wouldn't be going to his wife, because I'm sure, as we'll talk about, she has a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent because of the charges that she's facing currently. But they could certainly speak with other family members, his parents, siblings, people who know him in the community, to find out about him as a person, to find out about his involvement in the community, his background, his upbringing. In certain states, there are also evaluations by psychologists or psychiatrists. And in this particular case, that will likely happen because there are reporting requirements that are attendant to these certain sexual offenses. And of course, I'm referring to Megan's Law registration. And so many states will require an evaluation by what's known as the Sex Offender Assessment Board. In Pennsylvania, that's what we call it. I'm fairly certain that there are analogous boards in the state of Oklahoma that would do an evaluation like that. And depending on the circumstances, and depending even on what the pre-sentence investigation reveals, there might be an order for even a drug and alcohol or other substance abuse evaluation to see if those services might be necessary or might be recommended during the term of incarceration, if that were to be imposed.
And when it comes to the two other cases that are playing out, but specifically Cherie Walker, who is facing this charge of enabling the abuse, that Dustin Walker is pleading guilty. And I'm sure for her defense attorney, it might not be a surprise that it went this way. Like, once the news came out about the DNA, it kind of shows what happened inside of the home. But how does the fact that this is now somewhat final with a guilty plea impact how her case could go moving forward?
Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, I actually don't think it has much of an impact on the other defendants' cases, either one of them, frankly, because both of them are. Notice there's, as far as I know, there's no conspiracy charge, so there's no allegation from the state that this was action in concert, that there was some meeting of the minds or some agreement beforehand that this abuse, that this activity was going to take place. So one is not necessarily dependent on the other. But I think with both of the defendants that remain, the mother and the grandmother, there are viable motions from their defense attorneys to say, listen, our case has nothing to do with that defendant who pled guilty. He had a guilty mind and recognized the wrongfulness of his actions, and also recognized the evidentiary strength of the prosecution's case against him. That was his decision to make. That has no bearing on the guilt or not guilt of our client. So we're not even going to go there. We're not going to mention the stepfather's case. We're not going to mention the fact that he pled guilty or whatever potential penalty he might be facing. And we're going to say that the state still has a burden. The state still has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there was enabling happening, that this mother knew of the abuse that was happening, and it's a specific intent crime, that she had this knowledge and intended to allow this abuse to occur. And so to that extent, you need to prove all of these separate elements of this separate charge against her beyond a reasonable doubt, without any regard to what that other defendant, to what the stepfather knew, should have known, or did do and pled guilty to. So I do see them as separate entities, and I don't think one would influence the other very much.
And when you look at going back to Dustin Walker and the crimes that he is pleading guilty to, they're considered 85% crimes. And that would mean that he would have to serve at least 85%. Like, what goes into, once he's sentenced, maybe it's the rest of his life, maybe it's just a very long period of time. What goes into how long he actually will have to serve time?
Sure. So the sentencing judge will impose a sentence. And so, again, states vary. Some states will impose a flat sentence, meaning, it's 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or whatever the definite term of incarceration is. Other states will give a range. They'll say, 3 to 6 years or 15 to 30 years. I'm just giving you arbitrary numbers as an example. And in those states that give a range, the minimum has to be met. So that first number, that 3 of the 3 to 6, or that 15 of the 15 to 30. Now, even in states that will give a range of sentencing, typically that 85%, if there is such a thing as an 85% rule in those states, it would be 85% of the max. And so that could mean that if Dustin Walker is sentenced to a 20-year flat sentence, it would be 85% of those 20 years. If he's sentenced to a range, if Oklahoma is a state where they impose a ranged sentence, 15 to 30 years, for instance, it would typically be an 85% calculation of whatever the maximum sentence is. So it would almost certainly go beyond the minimum.
The charges, of course, like what he's done, what he's pleading guilty to. I mean, it's so difficult to just comprehend it. I think it's disgusting and sad. Come the day of his sentencing, and if he gives the greatest, stands up and is apologetic and says everything that someone can say in those moments when they have the opportunity to address the court, like, does any of that ever have an impact on a judge? Could it have an impact on a judge and how things go in that moment, that day, when you're given the opportunity to speak?
Absolutely. And I think that any judge in this country wouldn't be upholding their oath if they didn't fully consider a defendant's own allocution, meaning that the defendant gets to speak in his own defense or in his own right at a sentencing proceeding. So I think that it is the judge's responsibility to listen and to consider a defendant's admission or recognition of guilt, and assumption of responsibility and accountability, whether or not that is compelling enough to migrate a sentence downward, meaning to give a lesser term than a judge would have otherwise imposed, I don't know. But that's why we give our judges the trust from the community, and they are in those positions of authority to do what the record and what the circumstances and what their community deems appropriate in any particular case. And so it's entirely possible that a defendant's allocution could sway a judge. It's also entirely possible that a defendant's allocution could hurt their case and could end up making the sentence even stiffer or higher. So it really all depends.
And when it comes to the victim in this case, and for her to be so young, and then you also have this child, I mean, how does the system, when it comes to where they live, and I'm not sure what the family situation is beyond, the mom, the stepdad, and of course the grandmother facing the charges, but it seems like a unique situation where you have, someone still a newborn, and then you have someone who's incredibly young and still is a child as well. Like, how does the system handle that, and where they live, and what happens to them?
It is a potentially very, very sad story. I don't want to write the ending to this story before there is one. But this has the makings of a potentially very sad story. So I would hope that there are social workers involved. I would hope that there are child wraparound services involved that can help this child heal both as a child and as a survivor of this assault, and also give her the tools if she is in a position to wield them, to be a parent, if that is the direction she's taking her life, if she has opted to be a parent and be involved in this child's life. Whatever happens, I hope that they both, the victim and her child, I hope that they both have the supports they need to heal and to thrive physically, mentally, and emotionally.
And then just lastly, on the neglect charges, Dustin Walker is pleading guilty to 6 of those. And then Cherie Walker is facing those charges. And then Michelle Justus, she is facing the felony neglect charges as well. There were reports at the house where these people were living, did not have running water. On one hand, I know that people, everybody lives differently. Everybody has different situations. But in terms of the law, what is the bar for this is neglect, especially in cases involving minors?
Yeah. So again, it varies by state, and it's going to vary by community. And so most of our statutes and most of our legal standards are written to what's known as the reasonable person standard. So would a reasonable person in this defendant's position, living in this defendant's community, raising children in these circumstances, would that reasonable person who's, not coming from a completely different socioeconomic class, not coming from a completely different society, if you will, with different supports, we're talking about someone in this defendant's position, would they deem it reasonable to subject a child to these living conditions, or to deprive a child of the medical care, of the food, of the running water, of the other utilities and accommodations that they need? Would that person in that position deem it reasonable to raise a child or subject a child to those conditions? And if the answer is no, and if the evidence is compelling and met and proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then those elements would arguably be met, and a conviction could ensue.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens next in this case. A very, very difficult story out of Oklahoma, the Tulsa area there. Marian Bracha, always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Dustin Walker will be sentenced in June. That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're also streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.